There are some really big Heisman Trophy snubs over the past decade or two, and I'm going to highlight a few of them. Both actually happen to be Alabama players involved, and then Christian McCaffrey with Derrick Henry, and then Devonta Smith versus Jaylen Waddle. Um, Pretty interesting stuff here, but I'm going to spit the stats to you for each scenario. One happening in 2015 with Derrick Henry versus Christian McCaffrey, and the other in 2020, the shortened pandemic season with Jaylen Waddle and Devonta Smith. So I'm going to get into each of them as stats by stats. Obviously, the winners were, well, you may not know, the winners were, and even if it was obvious at the time, it's a lot of us forget who the Heisman Trophy winner was even last year, right? So Derrick Henry won it in 2015, running back for the Alabama Crimson Tide, and Devonta Smith, receiver, won it for Alabama in 2020. Both have fantastic seasons, not taking anything away from either guy, but I'm going to dive into each year and how I think the wrong guy in um, there was Heisman, like not necessarily the wrong guy in each scenario, but Heisman mishaps, I'll call it, or Heisman, unfortunate Heisman moments um, throughout the season for each. So with Henry and McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, and I have a lot of stats written down here, so I'm going to spit a lot of these numbers at you guys. And follow me, by the way, at PigskinPD on X. Peter Bartell is my name. The handle on X is there. And let me know in the comments what you think about this stuff. If I'm on here, yeah, especially with the Henry McCaffrey thing, which I'm going to go into first, or if you disagree and think Henry was the guy, he should have won it. But I'll get into it here and refer to my article too in written form, SaturdayBlitz.com. I just spit out like all of these numbers and laid them out and stuff too. So, and some other points for this one, this first one beyond the numbers. But Derrick Henry, as we know nowadays, is an NFL active legend because he's still playing. At the age of 30, the Titans cut ties with him. Maybe saw him as well. He's going to be washed up soon. And all he's done is put up so far a borderline MVP season for the Baltimore Ravens in his eighth NFL season. Or yeah, eighth this. So I think he's partway. This is like 3/4 of the way through his eighth season now. Him and Saquon Barkley with the Eagles are like fighting 1-2 for this MVP, which is cool to see in general for the resurgence of the running back position aside. But anyways, Henry not only had a legendary college career at Alabama, he continued that into the pros, right? First ballot Hall of Famer, no questions asked when he's done so far in 8 NFL seasons to date, 10,909 yards, 103 touchdowns, MVP caliber numbers. In college, Henry, remember, Trent Richardson, Mark Ingram, Eddie Lacy, Derrick Henry, like they were all there. So Henry for sure had to wait his turn like everybody else. He was not exempt from that despite his 5-star status out of Yulee, Florida, just north of Jacksonville. I remember just personal story. I was working in Jacksonville in like 2009, 2010 when Henry was like a seventh or eighth grader in high school, and the guys in my office, a lot of them were Florida fans. So at that time, they were like, man, this Henry kid, like they wanted him, right? Urban was in Florida, I think, at that time. So like towards the end of his run. But presumably they were on a high pretty much, right? So they thought they had a good chance of getting him as a local Florida kid. And I remember at that time eyeing this kid because they were showing me at that time, I think YouTube existed at least. So they were able to show me some highlights of him. It was crazy. I mean, the kid, look back, you can see Henry in like seventh or eighth grade was just at that time a man amongst boys. He was just head and shoulders above everybody else, size wise and everything, and it showed in his on the field play. And to think I'm looking at that, thinking this guy's got like 5 more years of high school, that's insane, and it ended up being insane. Um, anyways, fast forward to Bama, he finally gets his turn after waiting behind all those guys. 2015, Henry runs for 2,219 yards on the ground and 28 touchdowns. Fantastic season. You saw him a few years before that getting play in limited moments, right? Remember his sophomore year, the year before that, they played Oklahoma in the Sugar Bowl, which was a non-college football playoff bout. But he had a really good game. He showed out in that second half, especially. And you could tell like he was the next man up. And it was exciting. Yeah, Bama fans were excited to see the what would come in 2015, and ultimately came. Um, I'm still blaming that one on Lane Kiffin, as you know. In 2014. They lost that national title, I believe it was 2014, to Ohio State because they failed to run Derrick Henry in the second half. But I regress. So Henry that year he wins the Heisman in 2015. He had 1,832 votes total to Christian McCaffrey, also known as CMC. 1,539. McCaffrey played running back for the Stanford Cardinal, and many may think he was, and I thought this too. I was like, oh, he was a Jim Harbaugh guy because Harbaugh used to coach for the Cardinal. This was after Harbaugh left, and David Shaw was actually McCaffrey's head coach. Um, but anyways, McCaffrey had a stellar season. If you guys do remember back, this is now a decade ago, which is crazy to think about. But even up till just a couple years ago, it was getting more a national talk about McCaffrey got snubbed that year for the Heisman, and he should have won it. Henry shouldn't have won it. McCaffrey had 2,019 yards on the ground, so that was 200 less than Derrick Henry, right? However, Henry had only 91 yards receiving. McCaffrey had 645 yards receiving, a lot more than Henry, right? 13 touchdowns total. And then McCaffrey also was used in the kickoff return game for Stanford. 1,070 kickoff return yards, averaging 28.9 yards per kickoff return. If you do not remember it, look at like just YouTube McCaffrey's highlights that year on kickoff return, running back, etc. What I'm saying is he was a great all-around player, and that was definitely oversight by the Heisman Trophy voters. And that was the argument leading up to the Heisman too. Like Henry, and it's no knock on Henry for not being all around. Nick Saban was his coach at the time, just used him how they used him. Um, Burns. I forget the first name, but Bama had a great running back coach at that time that not only maximized Henry's talent, but Richardson, Lacey, Ingram. Like I mentioned all those before him. He was a legendary running back coach at Alabama, who I think has since retired or taken a lesser off the field role. I don't even know if he's still with the club, but that was that era. Scott Cochran was there as strength and conditioning coach, which helped. And you saw Henry had a great season on the ground for the Tide, um, but it wasn't. And they won the national title that year, right? But all around it wasn't McCaffrey, and yeah, the 13 touchdowns to Henry's 28 is glaring. I think that's the biggest number in the justification of why Henry won the Heisman. Because if you take those touchdown numbers away, it's a lot more receiving yards, 550 more receiving yards for McCaffrey. And also, because Henry wasn't utilized at all on kickoff, 1,070 more kickoff yards for McCaffrey. So overall yardage is absorbently more for McCaffrey, but that touchdown number is a lot less. And the running back, uh, from the because of the running back position, they just didn't use him like they used Henry. I mean, look at Henry's size, even in college, right? And now he's a battering ram. McCaffrey is muscular and built as well, but Henry is just a ram, and he's got speed. So he had that in college. That did not exist. So, um, just interesting to see the comparison between the two. And at the time, I am a huge fan of Nick Saban. I am so hardcore in Team Nick Saban. I just love what he built with that dynasty. That my friends would call me a Bama fan. I'm like, no, I'm not a Bama fan and never will be. I'm a Syracuse fan. You see it on my shirt. I just appreciate good coaches and dynasties, so to speak, or dynasties that could become one. Now I appreciate is Kirby Smart. I love that he came from under Saban. His building what he's building at Georgia. I'm excited to see that hopefully sustained. So that just certain coaches, and when Saban was there, I loved that whole tenure. So I was pretty deep in it, and I will say at that time I was biased towards Henry, but looking at it, even at that time secretly, I was like, yeah, McCaffrey's got a pretty good beef here, right? Just by the numbers. The other thing that hurt McCaffrey, I talked about those overall votes, and I didn't necessarily talk about them in a sense of like, oh, voters thought that, yeah, these are the numbers, but voters thought that Henry took precedent. There was a geographical challenge for McCaffrey there. Remember, McCaffrey at that time, Stanford was a member of the Pac 12. So he's going up against Washington conference games, Washington, Cal, Washington State, Oregon, Oregon State, UCLA, USC, to name a few in that conference. It looked a lot different than it does now. We know a few years later, the Pac 12 then became the Pac 10, and now the Pac 10 is fully disintegrated, right? You got teams in the Big 10, you got teams in the Big 12, etc. Washington State and Oregon State are kind of floating out there independently pretty much at this point. So, aside back then when McCaffrey played, Stanford, all of Stanford's conference games, all of them were West Coast. And ESPN broadcast, don't get me wrong, like it was pretty much ESPN Plus existed like full board. You wanted to watch a game, you could watch a game like it is nowadays. So that wasn't an issue. The issue was just the actual time. Number one. Number two, Stanford wasn't good. McCaffrey was on a double digit win team under David Shaw. But still, it's Stanford. They're not a college football blue blood. I think it'd be different if it was a USC, right? And people were like, USC's winning 10 plus games a year. People are going to stay up till 10 p.m. East Coast time, 7 West Coast, to watch a USC. We all watched Reggie Bush. Remember those games? Like, it didn't matter if Reggie was playing Arkansas in Fayetteville or playing on the West Coast at 10 a.m. or, sorry, 10 p.m. Eastern. You stayed up to watch Reggie Bush. You stayed up to watch Matt Leinart, Carson Palmer. You stayed up to watch those guys. Stanford just doesn't have that brand. In defense isn't the right word, but in defense of East Coast or Heisman voters, that all this stuff is going on in the SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, and Stanford didn't play any of those teams aside from me. I looked at the schedule. They played like UCF non-conference early on, which I think was in UCF. And then there was another game. It was East Coast-ish. But besides that, once you hit conference play, it doesn't matter if it's a home game at Stanford or you're traveling to UCLA, you're traveling to USC. That's all West Coast. So time zone matters. It's not the teams necessarily that they played. It's not the competition. It's as close as that vote was, too. Honestly, that's like 300 votes ish total away, right? You have to remember, votes are like points, right? There's first place votes, second place votes, third place votes. So Heisman voters can vote a guy first place and a guy second place and a guy third. So they're collectively, there's a number, and that collective number for McCaffrey was 300 ish less than Henry. That 300 ish less, you could argue, if the time zone was not a thing, McCaffrey would have won that in a landslide. Because you're not only going to make up that 300, in my opinion, you're going to make up even more than that. Because people are just going to see you more. Nowadays, Stanford, fast forward to this 2024 season, Stanford was actually playing in the ACC. So they played at Syracuse. They played Florida State. I forget what other games. I didn't look at their actual schedule that they played, but my point is what you can obviously insinuate. Half their games now were East Coast. When Christian McCaffrey played that year in 2015, I think, like I said, UCF might have been the only one on that slate. So he was at a huge disadvantage with all of those games. And kudos to him. The fact that he still had that gap as narrow as he had it. So geographically, just I think that hurt him. The overall rushing yards, the mystique of that, actually, Henry was slightly over that. And then Stanford, not quite frankly, not being a college blue blood, I'd like to say that record mattered, but Stanford actually had a good record that season. So that I'm not saying record should matter. I'm one of those that thinks if a guy's on a 4-8 club, if he has good numbers, he should win the Heisman. But aside, Stanford did have a good year that year. So if people are nitpicking, well, Bama had a better record, they were in the conversation. Yes, they were. So was Stanford at that time. David Shaw slowly regressed that program, and that's the reason he's no longer in seat. But when he was there, he good on him to an extent. He was able to sustain for a bit what Harbaugh had built when he was at Stanford. So that was the first example of I think Christian McCaffrey should have won it over Henry, but just some numbers to spit that out. The second one is not should have won it over Devonta Smith with Jaylen Waddle, but could have won it and what could have been scenario. And I understand there's what could have been scenarios all the time in college athletics. Well, this guy got hurt. This team had serious injuries. What they could have done if they didn't have those injuries, right? I just think it's neat to look at. And this is something that happened very early on in the season. So people didn't really even get a chance to say, man, that stinks, right? If only that guy had stayed healthy. It wasn't even magnified like that. But Bama fans, probably a few of them at least, will remember this and appreciate it. And I know I'd like to think Devonta Smith and Jaylen Waddle, both in the NFL still, if they talk, man, they probably honestly, I would think they'd have a candid conversation and Jalen just being like, and Devontae being like, dude, if you didn't get hurt, I was going to be the man. You know what I mean? So, um, Devontae going to, Jalen saying, sorry, I misspoke there. If you didn't get hurt, you were going to be the man because he was the man. What? Let me let me spit you these stats, and it's going to surprise you. So we all know Devontae Smith had a stellar season that year. I have him written down. 1,856 yards total, 23 touchdowns. Mind you, this was a pandemic shortened season as well. So Bama played 10 or 11 regular season games. Fantastic season. We all know that 2020 year, they went on to win the national championship with Mac Jones at the helm. Had a great, great year, prolific offense. It's argued to this day the best offenses in college football history. USC 2005 with Reggie Bush, LSU 2019 with Joe Burrow and that cast of receivers, and then Bama 2020 with Mac Jones. So put it in the chat aside, if you want to split hairs on that. But anyways, Devontae had a stellar season through his first 4 games. So mind you, the reason that Waddle did not even get Heisman consideration or anything, he got hurt after his 4th game. He got hurt very early on against Tennessee, and Tennessee fans will probably remember that, as will Bama fans. That cut his season short until the college football playoff. And even in the college football playoff, he tried to come back. He just wasn't. You could see him hobble, and he didn't have it totally. Aside, obviously, you get hurt after 4 games. Don't come back to the college football playoff. Your Heisman Trophy chances of having a great season are shot, right? He had put a lot on tape to that point in Alabama, which helped him the first 2 years. Remember, this guy had been showing out since freshman year. So that was good for him. But this junior year actually got cut short. Through 4 games, Devonta Smith had 483 receiving yards. Jaylen Waddle had 557. Each of them had 4 touchdowns. So that number is totally equal. Okay. If Jaylen Waddle had stayed healthy, he would have been on pace for 12 touchdowns. Like it was a 12-game season. That's what I did the math on, and 1,600 passing yards. Devontae, as I just mentioned, had 1,856 passing yards and 23 touchdowns. However, we saw the stat. I forget what percentage of the balls from Mac Jones went to Devonta Smith, but it was exorbitant that year, right? It was like 80 or 90% of Jones's passes went to Devonta. I mean, Devonta Slim Reaper. He still doesn't drop anything, right? And it was that way if you're an pro NFL fan or have forgotten about his days at Bama or didn't watch Bama, he wasn't dropping anything. So I'm not taking anything away from Devontae. I just think the dynamic would have been way different. What if, right? What if Jaylen didn't get hurt? Their first 4 games absolutely tells you otherwise. It doesn't tell you either that it was going to be 50-50. We really don't know, but what I saw with my eyes and on paper, the stats tell you Waddle was favored a good bit more than Devonta Smith was for the Crimson Tide that year. Now, it could have been the other what if is it could have been 50-50 ish. It could have been where you could also have maybe Waddle doesn't win it, but Devontae also does not. If Jaylen Waddle does not get hurt, you can concretely say Devonta Smith would not have won the Heisman Trophy in 2020 because the passes just would have been dispersed, right? Remember earlier on, Bama had a cast of Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, Devonta Smith, and Jaylen Waddle all on the same roster. That's why none of those 4 ever won the Heisman Trophy until a couple of them exited. Jeudy exited, Ruggs exited, so then became Devonta Smith and Jaylen Waddle. Less of dispersed, passes with Mac Jones, but then Waddle gets hurt, and obviously the majority, the bulk, are going to go to Devonta Smith. If Waddle never gets hurt, I think Waddle wins the Heisman. I think he is the Devonta Smith, even though Devonta was presumably would have been healthy on the field all year like he was. I still think that Jaylen Waddle was such a favorite target of Mac Jones that he would have been the Devontae Smith of 2020. Again, 557 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns through 4 games for Jaylen Waddle. Devontae Smith had 1,856 yards on the year, 23 touchdowns through 4 games. 4 touchdowns for Devontae, 483 receiving yards. Mind you, these were all SEC teams. I think they played Missouri, and I think A&M was one of the first 4. It was a different schedule because of the pandemic years. They eliminated the cupcakes, the FCS, the non-conference opponents, etc. The other staggering statistic that gives me confidence in this, Jaylen Waddle's yards per catch through his first 4 games before he got hurt, 29.3 yards per reception. To Devontae Smith's, get this, 12.4. That number would have absolutely mattered when it came to the Heisman Trophy. That Jaylen Waddle was, you think Devontae Smith was big play? He is. Waddle was next level. Waddle had that speed. Waddle, they said, was faster than Henry Ruggs, or it was 1-2-2-1 when Henry Ruggs was on the roster. So again, I'm not taking anything away from Devontae Smith. I just think it's worth. I like pointing this out to people because when you watch both guys who are good receivers in the NFL, Jaylen Waddle plays for the Miami Dolphins and Devontae Smith plays with the Philadelphia Eagles. Both are really good receivers, but Devontae is always coined as that Heisman winner. So he automatically gets that label, that prestige, that recognition of like, oh, this is the guy. This was the number one guy in college the year he won it. No, it was actually Jaylen Waddle until Jaylen Waddle got hurt. He broke his ankle, by the way. That was his actual injury. Um, on the field against Tennessee. I think he was going for a deep ball, as I recall, maybe down the right sideline, and it happened. But what next time you watch NFL games, remember that. Remember what I'm saying. Like, not again, not taking anything away from Devontae, and injuries happen. It's part of the game. There's probably that if you're listening to this show, you could probably think of while I've been speaking 3 or 4 snubs that you know about because of injuries that aren't snubs then. It's just unfortunate circumstance that didn't happen that I didn't mention. I don't know everything. These are just ones that I recall and that I remember that I thought were pretty interesting as a fan of the game, a nerd of the game to point out. But that, man, for that yards per reception, like we talked about McCaffrey having those 1,070 kickoff yards to Henry's 0, the 645 receiving yards to Henry's 91. This for Waddle versus Devontae Smith, 29.4 to 12.4. I think it was 29.4. I might be slightly off on that number. I had the article written up here. It was 23 yards per reception to 12.4. So not nearly 29, but still 10 yards more a reception for Waddle. So shout out. I was listening to Stephen Smith. He's uh, media person for Alabama. I was listening to his show about a year ago, and he told the story of when Devontae Smith was a freshman. That whole class I just mentioned, Judy, Waddle, freshman, Ruggs, and Smith, they all came in together, right? And or maybe 1 year apart. I think Judy might have been there a year before, but anyways, there was a huge cast of receivers, which Bama to this day since has not replicated that depth at the receiver position. That was not normal. Also before that, for Bama, it was always one guy. Amari Cooper, Calvin Ridley, everybody else. Then this this group of 4 got here and it just changed the game. So Stephen Smith he said, at their spring practice, and I think it might have been the first one early on in the season. And he walks in, and I think he asked somebody, one of the media people, like, where was Jerry Judy? And he's like, oh man, he's the guy. I want to watch him and everything. And somebody corrected him. He said, that's the guy you want to watch. They pointed to Devontae Smith. And he said he looked at Devontae and he saw what Devontae still is, the Slim Reaper. He's like scrawny, right? Like you look at the guy out in public and you're probably like, what do you do? Like you an accountant? Like, no, I'm a football player. I was the first round draft pick of the Philadelphia Eagles and Heisman Trophy winner. Hi, nice to meet you. You wouldn't think that, right? So even at that time, like it was just funny. Like Steven's like that that guy, like he probably thought he was a walk on, right? Because at that time he's a freshman, so nobody even knows who he is wearing that six. And but just funny, and then he turns into this Heisman Trophy winner, and deservedly so. But just the what if again, those scenarios are pretty fascinating sometimes to think about. So drop in the chat if you have any other ones that intrigued you, or in the comments over time beyond the Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, or the Jaylen Waddle, Devonta Smith. So appreciate everybody hopping on here. My handle on X is at PigskinPD. My name's Peter Bartell. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Trying to put out one of these a day. If you keep liking, I keep recording. If you dislike. At the same time, I try to be fair. We're all here to help each other. So curate your content. If you do not agree, you don't like it, feel like it's a waste of time, curate your content. And then you'll see less of it. Hopefully you do like, but just to be fair. Thanks everybody for hopping on.